He found a terrified child at her mother's grave. This Lakota chief's promise changed everything. The morning was quiet in a way that felt heavier than silence. The sky was pale, still waking up, and the land stretched wide and calm, just as it had for generations. The Lakota chief walked slowly along the narrow dirt path that led to the cemetery on tribal land. He came here often, especially at dawn, when the world felt honest and undisturbed. This was a place of memory, respect, and reflection. He was not dressed in anything special. No signs of rank or authority showed on him. To outsiders, he might have looked like just another older man taking a walk. But to his people, he carried responsibility, history, and quiet strength. He believed leaders should listen more than they speak, and mornings like this helped him do exactly that. The cemetery was small, surrounded by grass that moved gently with the wind. Wooden crosses, stone markers, and handmade signs stood together, each one telling a story without words. Some graves were old, worn by time. Others were new, the earth still dark and fresh. The chief paused near one of the newer graves, lowering his head out of respect. As he stood there, he noticed something that did not belong. At first it was just movement, a shadow shifting near the far edge of the cemetery. He thought it might be an animal, maybe a stray dog or a bird searching for food. But then the shadow moved again, slower this time, and he realized it was a child. She was small, far too small to be alone in a place like this. She crouched behind a headstone, as if trying to disappear into it. Her clothes were dirty and too thin for the morning air. Her hair was tangled, and her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees. She looked frozen, not from the cold alone, but from fear. The chief did not rush toward her. He knew better. Children who are afraid do not trust sudden movements. He stayed where he was and spoke softly, his voice calm and steady, like the wind moving through tall grass. "You don't need to hide," he said gently. "You're safe here." The child did not answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, wide and unsure. She looked like someone who had learned not to expect kindness. Slowly, the chief took a step closer, then another, leaving space between them. He lowered himself to one knee so he would not seem so tall. He wanted to be seen not as a leader, but as a human being. "My name is not important right now," he said, "but I see you." That seemed to reach her. Her grip loosened just a little. She swallowed, as if trying to find her voice. When she finally spoke, it was barely louder than a whisper. "She's here," the girl said. The chief followed her gaze to the grave beside her. The soil was freshly turned, and a simple marker stood at the head. No flowers yet, no decorations, just a name carved into wood. Her mother. Understanding settled in the chief's chest like a heavy stone. This child was not visiting. She was waiting. "How long have you been here?" he asked carefully. The girl shrugged. "Since yesterday." The chief felt the weight of those words. Yesterday, through the night, alone. "Did someone bring you here?" he asked. She nodded once. "My mom's friend. She said she'd come back, but she didn't," the chief said quietly. The girl shook her head. Her eyes filled with tears, but none fell. She had likely learned how to hold them in. The chief sat down fully on the ground now, keeping his movements slow. He noticed the girl was holding something close to her chest, a piece of cloth, worn and faded. It looked like part of a shirt or scarf. He understood without asking. It was all she had left of her mother. No child should have to sit beside a grave waiting for someone who may never return. "You must be tired," he said gently. "Hungry, too." She nodded again, this time more clearly. The chief took off his jacket and held it out, not pushing it toward her, just offering. After a moment of hesitation, she reached out and took it. Her hands were cold. "My name is—" She stopped herself, then tried again. Her voice broke. "That's okay," he said quickly. "You don't have to tell me yet." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that does not feel empty. The wind moved through the grass, and the sun rose a little higher, warming the land. The chief thought of all the children who slipped through cracks no one wanted to see, children whose pain was quiet, children who were easy to overlook. He looked at the small grave again. He did not know the woman buried there, but he respected her. She had brought life into the world. She had loved this child enough to try, even if the world had been unkind to her. The chief made a decision then, not a loud one, not a public one. A decision made in the heart. "You don't have to stay here anymore," he said softly. "I won't leave you." The girl studied his face, searching for something she could believe in. Slowly, she stood up. She was smaller than he had thought. As they walked away from the grave together, the chief glanced back once more. He bowed his head in respect, not just for the woman who rested there, but for the promise he was already beginning to carry. The chief did not take the child straight to his home. He knew that moving too fast could frighten her again. Instead, he brought her first to the small community center near the edge of the land. It was a familiar place, filled with warmth, the smell of coffee, and the quiet voices of elders who often gathered there in the mornings. He wanted her to feel safe before anything else happened. When they entered, a few elders looked up in surprise. They noticed the child right away. Her tired eyes, her unsteady steps, the way she stayed close to the chief, as if he were the only solid thing in the room. No one asked questions at first. Among them, silence was a form of respect. The chief found a chair for the girl near the heater. He brought her a cup of warm soup and a piece of bread. He did not rush her. He simply placed the food nearby and sat a short distance away, letting her decide. After a few moments, hunger won over fear. She ate slowly at first, then with more confidence, as if her body finally believed it was allowed to rest. An older woman gently placed a folded blanket around the girl's shoulders. The child flinched at first, then relaxed when she felt the warmth. She whispered a quiet thank you, almost surprised by the sound of her own voice. The chief watched carefully. Every small movement mattered. He noticed how the girl kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to come and take her away. He understood that look. It was the look of someone who had learned that safety never lasted long. Once the girl finished eating, the elders gathered closer. Still, they kept their voices low. This was not a meeting meant for loud opinions or quick decisions. This was about a child's future. The chief spoke first. He explained what he had seen at the cemetery. He did not add emotion or judgment. He simply told the truth. When he finished, the room felt heavier, as if everyone was holding the same breath. One elder broke the silence. She said the child should be reported to outside services immediately. That was the usual process. Another elder nodded but added that the process often separated children from their culture, sometimes forever. A third elder reminded them of past cases where children were moved far away and never returned. The discussion remained calm, but the tension was clear. Everyone wanted to do what was right, yet no one agreed on what that looked like. The child sat quietly through it all. She did not understand every word, but she understood enough. She could feel the uncertainty. Her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. The chief noticed. He raised his hand gently, asking for quiet. When the room settled, he turned toward the girl. "You are not in trouble," he said softly. "No one here is angry with you." She nodded, though her eyes stayed cautious. "We are just trying to make sure you're safe," he continued. She hesitated, then spoke. "I don't want to go with strangers." Her voice was small, but the words were strong. They landed hard in the room. The chief felt something shift inside him. He had heard those words before, spoken by other children in other times. Too often they were ignored. He turned back to the elders. "She needs time," he said. "Time to breathe, time to trust." Some elders agreed. Others looked unsure. The rules were not flexible, and everyone knew it. That evening, the chief made another quiet choice. He offered to take responsibility for the child, at least for now. Not as an official guardian, but as a protector, someone she could stay with while decisions were made. There were murmurs of concern. It was a heavy responsibility. There could be consequences. The chief knew that better than anyone. Still, he did not hesitate. "She will stay with me tonight," he said. When he spoke those words, the child looked up at him. For the first time since he had met her, there was something new in her expression. Not trust yet, but hope. The chief's home was modest and simple, a small house filled with books, photographs, and reminders of a life spent serving others. When they arrived, he showed the girl a small room near the back. It had a bed, a clean pillow, and a window that faced the open land. "You can sleep here," he said. "The door stays open if you want." She stepped inside slowly, touching the edge of the bed as if making sure it was real. She placed her mother's cloth carefully under the pillow. That night, the chief sat alone at his kitchen table, long after the house grew quiet. He knew this was not just about one child. What he was doing could bring attention, questions, and pressure from outside. People might say he was crossing a line. But he also knew this: leadership meant stepping forward when others stepped back. Before going to bed, he checked on the girl. She was asleep, her face relaxed for the first time. He adjusted the blanket gently and turned off the light. In the darkness, he made a promise, not spoken aloud, not written down, a promise made in the heart. He would not let her disappear. He would not let her be forgotten. He would stand with her until she belonged somewhere again. Outside, the night was still. The land held its breath as if listening. The days after the child came to stay with the chief were not easy, but they were filled with quiet discovery and slow steps toward trust. Every morning the chief woke early, as he always did, and the child was usually awake before him. Sometimes she would be sitting on the small porch watching the land stretch wide, her knees pulled to her chest. The chief never rushed her. He understood that healing could not be forced, and that patience was sometimes more powerful than any action. At breakfast, he would sit across from her at the table, gently encouraging her to eat. At first, she barely touched the food. Her appetite was small, and fear often made her hand shake. But he never complained or scolded. Instead, he would tell her small stories of the land, of the animals that roamed nearby, and of the stars that shone over the plains at night. His voice was calm, steady, and careful, never demanding, never harsh. Slowly, she began to eat a little more each day. Slowly, she began to speak a few words in response. First, it was hello, then thank you, then small questions about the world outside the porch. The chief knew that trust could not come overnight. The child had lived in a world where promises were broken too often. People left when they said they would stay. Love sometimes disappeared before it could fully arrive. And so, every action the chief took was deliberate. Every word, every gesture, every meal, every moment was a quiet message. You are safe here. You are seen. You are not alone. Outside, the land was vast and beautiful. The child had never spent much time in such open spaces. In the small town she had come from, streets were narrow and crowded, and the sky was often hidden behind tall buildings. Here, the sky stretched forever. The grass moved like waves in the wind, and the air smelled sweet and clean. The chief would walk with her along the paths, pointing out different trees and plants, telling stories of how his ancestors lived with the land, how they listened to it, and how they learned from it. At first, the child remained quiet, only nodding. But over time, she began to ask questions. She wanted to know the names of the birds that sang, the plants that grew, and even the stories behind the old, worn stones at the cemetery. One afternoon, as they walked together near the graves, the child finally spoke about her mother. Her voice was soft, almost afraid it might break the moment. She told the chief small things, how her mother loved to sing while cooking, how she would tie her hair in a braid every morning, how she would always tell the child that she was brave, even when things felt hard. The chief listened quietly, never interrupting. When she finished, he said only this: "Your mother's love is still with you. It never leaves, even if she is not here." The child's eyes filled with tears, but this time, the tears were not from fear. They were from recognition, from remembering something safe and loving in a world that had been difficult. The chief also began to introduce her slowly to other members of the community. At first, the child was shy. She would hide behind the chief's legs, clinging to him as if he were her only shield. But the elders approached gently. They shared small gifts, a blanket, a story, a song. They never asked for anything in return. They simply offered kindness. And gradually, the child began to relax. She learned that this community was not like the strangers who had let her down before. Here, people kept their promises. Here, people remembered their own stories and respected the stories of others. One day, the chief brought her to the small schoolroom in the community center. It was not a large place, and it was quiet, with desks neatly lined up and books on every shelf. The child had never been to a school like this. In her past, she had attended briefly, but it had always been chaotic and inconsistent. Here, the chief introduced her to the teacher, a kind woman with a gentle voice. The teacher knelt to speak at the child's level, never overwhelming her, never pushing her too fast. The chief stayed nearby, letting the child know he was still there if she needed him. By the end of the day, she had colored a small picture of a tree in the sun, her first real art in a long time. The chief praised her softly, telling her how beautiful her work was. She beamed with a small, proud smile. But the chief also knew the child carried more than just fear. She carried memories of instability, of times when she did not know where she would sleep, of nights when she was alone. Sometimes in the middle of the night she would wake up crying softly or call out for her mother. The chief would rise quietly, bring her a warm blanket, sit with her until she calmed down, and tell her stories of courage and strength. Sometimes he would tell stories of his own childhood, of the times he had faced fear and learned to stand with it. Over time, the child began to sleep longer, and the moments of fear became shorter. The chief also encouraged her to play, to move, to use her imagination. He brought her to the open fields to run, to chase butterflies, to watch birds. They built small forts from fallen branches and leaves. They counted stars at night and named them. The child began to smile more often. She laughed, sometimes quietly, sometimes with a full voice that surprised even her. And each laugh, each smile, was a small victory. Each one proved that trust and love could exist again. Even so, the chief knew that he could not simply keep the child to himself forever. The world beyond their small community would ask questions. Rules and systems existed for a reason, even if they were not perfect. Still, he did not let the thought overwhelm him. He focused on the present, on the small victories, on the trust being built one day at a time. One morning he took the child back to the cemetery. This time it was not to sit in fear or sadness. It was to honor the mother together. They brought a small bouquet of flowers and laid them carefully on the grave. The chief taught the child a simple prayer, a promise of respect and remembrance. The child repeated the words, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. She placed her hand on the soil, feeling a connection not just to her mother, but to her own past and her own strength. The chief watched quietly, knowing that these small moments mattered more than anyone might realize. The community began to notice the change in the child. She walked with a little more confidence. She spoke in full sentences. She began to ask questions, to seek answers, to show curiosity about the world and about herself. The chief felt proud, but he did not let her see it as a reward. He wanted her to grow naturally, to believe in herself, not in the praise of others. And yet, challenges remained. There were still moments when she would retreat, when fear or grief would resurface. Sometimes she would refuse food or hide in corners, but the chief never forced her. He knew that healing required space, time, and patience. He simply stayed, offering presence, offering safety, offering love. He reminded her often that she was not alone, and that her story mattered. Through it all, the chief reflected on his own responsibilities. Leadership was more than guiding a community. Sometimes leadership was quiet, invisible, filled with patience and small acts of care. Protecting this child, nurturing her trust, and standing with her through fear and uncertainty became one of his most important responsibilities. And in doing so, he discovered something unexpected. This child, with all her fragility and courage, was teaching him as much as he was teaching her. Over the weeks, a rhythm emerged. Mornings were for waking and eating, for small lessons about the world. Afternoons were for walks, for play, for learning about culture and community. Evenings were for stories, reflection, and preparation for sleep. Slowly, steadily, the child began to trust the world again. And with that trust, she began to discover her own strength, a strength she had always carried, but which had been hidden under fear and loss. The chief often sat quietly at the edge of the room or on the porch, watching her, thinking about how fragile yet resilient children could be. He thought about how easily the world could break them, but also how gently the world, when guided by care and presence, could help them rebuild. And he made a quiet promise to himself. No matter the challenges that lay ahead, he would stand with her, protect her, and help her grow into the person she was meant to be. The days were long, but the progress was real. And slowly, very slowly, the terrified child from the cemetery became a child who could smile, speak, and hope. She was still learning, still healing, still finding her place in the world. But now, she knew she was not alone. And that knowledge, small as it might seem, was everything. The days turned into weeks, and the child began to settle into a new rhythm. Each morning she woke up a little earlier, often stretching her small arms toward the ceiling with a quiet yawn. The chief noticed these small moments, understanding that they were signs of trust beginning to bloom. She no longer clutched her mother's cloth constantly, although it remained folded neatly under her pillow, a treasured reminder of love lost but not forgotten. The chief made sure that every day had purpose. Some days were for learning, the names of plants, the stories of the animals, and the songs of their ancestors. Other days were for practical lessons, like helping to fetch water from the small stream near the land, sweeping the floors, or preparing a simple meal. He believed that responsibility, given gently and without pressure, helped children regain a sense of control in their lives. The child began to help willingly, taking pride in small accomplishments. One afternoon, the chief decided it was time for her to meet a few more people in the community. They walked slowly toward the gathering space where elders often shared stories and meals. The child clutched his hand tightly at first, glancing around with cautious eyes. But the chief spoke softly, reminding her that these were friends, not strangers. When they arrived, a group of children were already playing quietly near the open field. The chief knelt and introduced the child to them. "This is someone new," he said. "She is learning about our ways and our stories. Will you show her kindness?" The children paused and looked at her with curiosity. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But one little boy stepped forward, holding a small carved wooden bird he had made. He offered it shyly, and the child's eyes widened. She took it gently, examining it with fascination, and then smiled. A small, hesitant smile, but a real one. Over the next few hours, the child played with the other children under the chief's watchful eyes. She laughed, sometimes hiding behind the chief when a game became too loud or fast. But gradually she joined in more fully. For the first time she realized that being with other children did not always lead to fear or pain. Sometimes it led to laughter, learning, and friendship. That evening, the chief and the child sat on the porch together. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air smelled faintly of wild flowers and grass. The child held her wooden bird carefully in her lap. "I liked today," she said quietly.
"They didn't laugh at me."
The chief smiled gently.
"You have a place with them just as you have a place here," he said.
"They will learn from you, just as you are learning from them." She looked at him with wide eyes, as if surprised that anyone could see her strength. "Do you think I can belong?" she asked softly. "You already do," he replied. "Belonging is not about where you live or what you have. It is about being seen and loved for who you are. You are seen. You are loved. You belong." The child stayed quiet for a long time after that, thinking, perhaps for the first time, that belonging might be possible. In the following weeks, the chief continued to introduce her to the elders. Each elder shared stories from their past, songs of their ancestors, and lessons about the land. The child listened carefully, repeating words and phrases when asked, learning not only language but culture, tradition, and history. The chief encouraged her to ask questions and to share her own thoughts, reminding her that her voice mattered. Slowly she began to participate in the small ceremonies the community held. At first she watched quietly, standing behind the chief, unsure if she belonged. But the chief guided her gently, teaching her the steps, showing her when to bow, when to speak softly, and when to listen. By the end of each ceremony she felt a little more part of the circle, a little more connected to the community that had once seemed distant and unknowable. Despite the growing trust, there were still moments of struggle. Some mornings she refused to leave her room. Some nights she awoke crying for her mother, clutching the chief's hand tightly. Each time the chief responded with patience. He would kneel beside her, speak softly, and remind her that her feelings were real and valid. He did not try to push her beyond her limits. Instead, he offered consistency, a steady presence that slowly replaced fear with security. The chief also recognized the importance of connecting her to her mother's memory. He helped her create a small memory box where she placed letters, drawings, and small items that reminded her of her mother. Together they added fresh flowers to the grave each week, and the chief taught her simple prayers of respect and remembrance. The child began to understand that honoring her mother did not mean keeping sadness forever. It could also mean remembering love and finding strength from it. One day the chief suggested a longer walk across the land. They moved past the cemetery and the small fields, into the wider plains. The child held his hand, but she walked taller now, her steps more confident. He told her stories of the ancestors who had walked these plains before her, who had faced challenges and survived with courage. He spoke of resilience, of standing strong even when life was difficult. The child listened quietly, absorbing the words, her eyes scanning the horizon with wonder. At the end of the walk, they reached a small hill that overlooked the land. The sun was low, casting long shadows and golden light. The child sat down, taking in the vastness of the land, the beauty of the sky, and the quiet strength of nature. The chief sat beside her and said, "This land has seen many stories. It has seen sadness, but it has also seen hope. You are part of that story now. You can choose what you carry forward." The child thought about her past, about the moments of fear and loss. But she also thought about the chief, the elders, the children she had met, and the kindness she had felt. For the first time she felt a quiet sense of power, not power over others, but power over herself, her choices, and her future. The chief smiled at her quietly, understanding that this was a turning point. The child was no longer just surviving. She was beginning to thrive. And with thriving came responsibility, growth, and the opportunity to shape her own path. As the weeks passed, the community began to see the change as well. The child helped other children learn, shared small acts of kindness, and began to speak more confidently in gatherings. People noticed the way she listened to elders, asked questions, and remembered details from stories and lessons. Her presence reminded everyone of the power of patience, care, and guidance. The chief watched quietly, proud but not boastful. He knew that the true victory was not in praise, but in the child's growing confidence and trust. He understood that leadership meant creating space for others to grow, to heal, and to find strength. And in doing so, he realized that the child was teaching him as much as he was teaching her. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned deep shades of purple and orange, the chief and the child sat by a small fire outside. The child held a notebook, where she had been drawing pictures of the land, the animals, and the people she had met. She showed him a drawing of a tree with long spreading branches. "This is our tree," she said, smiling. "It holds everyone, like a family." The chief looked at the drawing and nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "It holds everyone."
And you are part of it.
The child's smile widened. She began to understand that family was not just about blood. It was about care, presence, and love. And slowly she realized that she had a new family now, a family that would not abandon her, that would stand by her, and that would help her grow into the person she was meant to be. That night, the child slept peacefully for the first time in many weeks. The chief checked on her before going to his own room. She held the wooden bird she had received from the other children close to her chest, her breathing steady and calm. The chief adjusted the blanket gently and whispered softly, "You are safe. You are seen. You are loved." And as he left the room, he knew that the journey was far from over. Challenges would still come. Decisions would still need to be made. But the child had found hope, trust, and strength, and that was the beginning of everything. Time passed, and the seasons slowly changed. The sun rose and set over the wide plains, casting long shadows in the morning and bathing the land in soft gold in the evening. The child, who had arrived timid and frightened, had grown stronger in both body and spirit. She now walked with confidence, her eyes bright with curiosity and intelligence, her small hands steady and capable. The chief watched her carefully, noticing every small step forward, every smile, every word spoken aloud, and every question asked with interest. Though she had found comfort and care with the chief, the question of her family's future still lingered. The chief had continued searching for any living relatives. He knew the importance of connecting a child to her family, but he also understood that the process had to be done gently. Too often, children were moved too quickly from one place to another, and the bond of trust that had been built was broken. He wanted her to have a family, but he also wanted her to have stability, love, and a sense of belonging. One morning he received news that a distant relative had been located, an aunt who lived in a neighboring town. She had heard of the child and wanted to meet her. The chief prepared carefully. He spoke to the child, explaining that someone who loved her mother still existed and wanted to meet her. He emphasized that meeting her aunt did not mean leaving immediately, that she could take her time, and that she had a voice in every decision. The child's reaction was a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. She clutched her mother's cloth, hesitating to speak. "Will she be nice?" she asked softly. The chief smiled gently.
I think she will.
"But remember, you decide what you are ready for. No one can rush you." When they arrived at the aunt's home, the child stayed close to the chief. The aunt greeted her with open arms, her eyes filled with warmth and gentle tears. She spoke softly, telling the child about her mother, sharing memories and explaining how she had always hoped to meet her. The child listened quietly, still unsure, still cautious, but also slowly realizing that there were people beyond her current home who cared deeply. The first meeting was short and gentle. The child returned to the chief's home afterward. Thoughtful and quiet, she clutched her mother's cloth, turning it over in her small hands. The chief did not push her to say anything, did not demand that she express herself. Instead, he simply sat with her, allowing her to reflect. After a long pause, she finally whispered, "I think I might like to see her again." Over the following weeks, she spent short periods with her aunt, each visit growing longer and more comfortable. The chief accompanied her at first, supporting her and observing the interactions. Each time the child returned with stories and memories, her small face brightening as she recounted things her aunt had shown or told her. Slowly, she began to build a relationship, discovering a connection to family that she had almost forgotten existed. Even with this growing bond, the child continued to maintain her place within the community that had nurtured her. She attended lessons with the elders, participated in ceremonies, and played with the children in the fields. She had learned that belonging could be more than one place. She belonged to her new family, to her community, and to herself. And each of these bonds gave her confidence, hope, and strength. The chief continued to guide her carefully. He reminded her often that she had a voice in her own life, that she could make choices, and that her feelings mattered. He helped her understand that family could be complex, but love and care could exist in many forms. The child began to speak more openly about her thoughts and fears, sharing her worries with the chief and receiving guidance without judgment. One afternoon, the chief and the child walked to the cemetery, the place where it had all begun. The sun was high, casting gentle shadows over the freshly turned soil and the small, simple markers that dotted the land. The child carried a small bouquet of flowers, her small hand steady and purposeful. Together, they laid the flowers on her mother's grave. She placed her hand gently on the soil, whispering a quiet promise. "I will remember you," she said softly. "I will be brave. I will be kind. I will try to be like you wanted me to be." The chief nodded silently, understanding the depth of her words. The child was not only remembering her mother, she was learning to carry the love and lessons forward into her own life. She had begun to see that grief could coexist with hope, that memory could coexist with growth. As the weeks became months, the child's life began to settle into a new normal. She continued school, learning letters, numbers, and stories. She helped in the community, learning not only practical skills but also the values of patience, respect, and kindness. She participated in traditional songs and dances, her voice joining the elders in a harmony that was both gentle and proud. And she laughed often, sometimes quietly, sometimes with abandon, her laughter a clear sign of the healing that had taken place. The aunt remained involved, but carefully. She never tried to pull the child away from the community or from the chief. Instead, she worked with them, respecting the child's pace and choices. Slowly, a bond formed, a bond of trust, respect, and love that grew steadily over time. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in soft pinks and purples, the child sat with the chief on the porch. She held a small drawing she had made of a tree with wide protective branches. "This is our tree," she said. "It holds everyone we care about." The chief smiled softly. "Yeah. It holds everyone, and you are part of it. You will always have a place here, no matter where life takes you." The child nodded, her eyes shining. She understood something that had been hard to grasp before. Family was not only about being together under one roof. Family was about care, presence, and love. Family could include more than one home, more than one set of people, more than one way of being. And she had discovered that she could belong in many ways without losing herself. The community had also begun to recognize the changes in her. She spoke more confidently in gatherings, offered help without being asked, and shared stories of what she had learned. She encouraged other children, helped them with small tasks, and smiled with warmth and kindness. Her presence reminded everyone of the power of patience, care, and steady guidance. The chief watched quietly, proud but humble. He knew that his promise had not been easy to keep. It had required patience, courage, and wisdom. But in seeing the child grow, heal, and thrive, he understood that leadership was not measured in titles or authority, but in care, trust, and the ability to stand with those who needed it most. As the seasons continued to change, the child grew taller and more confident. She still held her mother's cloth, still visited her mother's grave, but she no longer carried fear or uncertainty in her eyes. She had found hope, trust, and strength. She had discovered family in many forms, love in many ways, and belonging that reached deep into her heart. One day the child asked the chief quietly, "Do you think I can be happy?" The chief looked at her, his eyes soft and steady. "You already are," he said. "Happiness is not always loud or constant. It grows quietly, slowly, like a tree.
You have roots now.
You have people who love you. You have yourself. And with that, happiness will always find a place in your heart." The child smiled, finally understanding. She no longer carried the fear that had once shadowed her every step. She had learned to trust, to hope, and to believe in herself. And she had learned that love could be gentle, steady, and unbreakable. The chief reflected on everything that had happened, from the moment he found her at the cemetery trembling and alone, to the present day, where she walked confidently, laughed freely, and spoke her mind with courage. He realized that promises could change everything. A promise made quietly in the heart, kept with patience and care, could transform a life. The child's journey was far from over. Challenges would still come, as they always did in life, but she now carried the tools she needed: trust, courage, love, and the knowledge that she belonged. And she knew she would never walk alone. The chief and the child stood together one evening, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The land was quiet, beautiful, and timeless. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "This is only the beginning. Your story is yours to write, and you will write it with strength, love, and hope." The child nodded, her eyes shining with understanding. For the first time, she believed it was true. She had found safety, family, community, and herself. And she knew that life, with all its challenges and joys, was hers to live fully and courageously. And so, the child, once lost and afraid, stepped into her future with trust in her heart, courage in her mind, and love surrounding her at every turn. Her story became a quiet lesson for all who knew it, that even in the darkest moments, a promise kept, a hand held, and love given freely could change everything.